Angela Joya will be the next speaker. Angela is a professor of global political economy at the University of Oregon. Please welcome Angela.
Thank you very much for coming here today, and thank you to the Canadian Peace Alliance for organizing this event. I wish I had attended yesterday's and the rest of today's event. I'm going to speak in detail about the chapter that I have written, but since Greg and Todd have outlined the broad framework of the book, I'll try to focus more on Canada's state-building mission in Afghanistan. So more of a case study, but not specifically drawing on my chapter. Some of the statistics that have been coming out and some of the reports that have been coming out in the last 2 years on Afghanistan, I'll be referring to some of that, just to, in a way of assessing the outcome of the war that has been fought for over a decade in Afghanistan. So Canada's mission broadly ended in July 2011 in a combat role, but Canada still has around 620 soldiers in training role in Afghanistan. So we have not really completed the mission in Afghanistan, and we don't know broadly what the soldiers are engaged in, but it's part of building the Afghan national force at the moment. And as the talk of NATO's withdrawal in 2014, this year has been going on, there are questions, concerns on all sides. Those who supported the war, they're worried that the withdrawal is too soon, that they haven't really accomplished the state-building mission in there. And the rest of us who were anti-war, to start with, were really concerned about the cost of war on the taxpayers in Canada, in the United States, but the cost of it on Afghani civilians and Afghani state. So broadly, I'll outline a few things. If you look at Afghanistan over the last, since 2001 up to now, the outcome of war has brought no stability, no security. And I'm following Afghanistan's news regularly, not just through English media, but Afghani media on a regular basis. And there's constant concern about lack of security that's affecting everybody, not just those in the provinces, but in the capital, Kabul. There is no democracy, which was one of the initial goals to develop there. The Taliban, who were the initial main target of this war, are ever more powerful and in fact more legitimate in the eyes of the people in Afghanistan after the war. And so this is probably thanks to the NATO war effort there that's given them that legitimacy, which they didn't have initially. And as Thomas Walker has argued in some of his articles, if this war had ended maybe 80 years ago, the Taliban might not have been in the position they are now in the eyes of the people. And then there has been an increase in suicide bombings, which has worsened the situation, the security situation. As you might have noticed 2 days ago, there was a suicide bombing right in the capital that actually cost the lives of 2 Canadians as well. And in terms of the country in general, lawlessness is quite rampant across the country, where militias are empowered, where local religious leaders are the ones who are making laws. And I will get in a bit of detail about a specific case of Afghanistan and why these problems are so rampant. In the case of Canada, we have seen the loss of 161 deaths, which included 157 soldiers. There's been over 600 injuries of soldiers. And in general, recently it has been coming out that there's been increasing cases of suicides among the veterans of the war. And so this issue has been highlighted increasingly in the newspapers, as well as to how the Canadian state has ignored the heroes that they sent out to fight the war in Afghanistan. And on top of that, the cost of war, which is estimated at 11.3 billion and climbing, as we know that the mission hasn't ended. So that's still to be accounted for. And so to move on to the case of Afghanistan, there are a few things I will discuss. First, the power holders there and how that has changed. Next, women, the role of women, how that has changed, and then more specifically about the role of children and healthcare in Afghanistan. And these are some of the broader, social issues that will be highlighted by looking at the case of children. And these are based on some of the recent reports, I think it was early in January, that came out in New York Times and highlighted also by some of the International Crisis Group about the situation of women and children and people in general in Afghanistan. And then just wrap that section, and then I will speak a bit more about state building and the failure of it in Afghanistan. So the power holders that existed in Afghanistan in 2001 were the Taliban, and they were initially booted out of power, and Karzai was put in place. But now, as the NATO forces have been winding down their mission, the Taliban have been re-empowered. They are involved in negotiations. In fact, negotiations have been going on for a number of years, and now they have probably more clout in terms of what they're pressing for in the future Afghan state. And so their demands are increasingly rising fears, leading to rising fears among human rights groups, among women's groups, as to what they will demand. So some of the social, political gains by women's groups, by NGOs, by civil society groups, are that once Taliban come back to the negotiating table, and if they engage in actual politics, that they will probably lead to more regressive, repressive, conservative laws that will be enacted, and that Karzai and those who are in the parliament in Afghanistan will be more open to that, just because of the pressing need for security in the country. In terms of women's rights, now once again I'm referring to this New York Times article and a few video clips that were recordings of the head of Independent Human Rights Commission in Afghanistan, Seema Samar. She was talking about an increase in the level of violence and especially public displays of violence against women across the country. She was referring to examples of mass rape, cutting off different parts of the bodies of women, and simple executions of women based on local laws and local judgments of mullahs, for instance, in various provinces of the country. And in 2009, and this is one of the important laws that were passed and celebrated in the West, especially in Canada, I recall, there was a law called the Elimination of Violence Against Women that was passed. And increasingly now that law has been under threat, that there's possibility of it being rolled back. And so some of the conservative forces inside the parliament, knowing that the Taliban are now more legitimate, they are supporting a reversal of this law and possibly dismantling of it on the basis of it not being Sharia compliant. And this is where I want to highlight that Canada's been quite involved over the last 5-6 years, at least in Kabul, in development of justice and the law school in there, justice structures in there, and apparently all of those are quite a failure because all the justice that's delivered in Afghanistan are through local religious institutions of mullahs, and the laws that they refer to through what they believe is the right thing according to Islam. So none of these have borne any fruit for women and progressive forces in the country. And so next I'll move on. I'm not going to go into detail about situation of women, but if you notice in the newspapers, there are increasingly reports of fears by women's groups, NGOs coming out, and so they're discussing in detail what kind of specific concerns they have. And next I'm going to the case of children, and this is quite important because there's a considerable percentage of children who are suffering from chronic malnutrition or long-term malnutrition, which has quite dire effects in the long-term development of this next generation of Afghan youth who will be basically building the economy in the country. The statistics by the Ministry of Health indicate that over 50% of children are suffering from this, and this is across the country. Now the reasons for this, it's not that the economy is not doing so well. Production is happening in rural areas, but because of war and conflict, internal refugees, movement across the country, and basically lack of being in the same place and lack of health care by the government are causing all of this. And there are concerns by Médecins Sans Frontières that there is no possibility of delivering any kind of aid to them because of lack of negotiations with Iran and with Pakistan by NATO forces, which are the two countries that have access to ships delivery of food and aid to these children. So there is a deep concern that in the next 10-20 years, there will be a generation of really unhealthy youth in the country. And that's linked to maternal health, maternal rights of reproduction, which are also undermined, and they have not really done much work in developing the rights of women at the local community level. And in general, they're pointing out, this is also statistics of various ministries in Afghanistan, that in general poverty levels have increased over the last 10, 15 years. And they define poverty level as, income sufficient to provide 2,100 calories per day. And they're saying that 36%, according to that kind of standard, 36% of the population are currently living below the poverty level. So quite a pressing need for dealing and targeting those challenges. And so I will move on now to just broadly touching now on some of the themes that I discussed in my chapter, which was about the state building project that Canada engaged in Afghanistan and their military occupation, and what kind of outcome could it possibly have. Over the course of the years, I guess since the war began, we had been pointing out in various events that this kind of state building project is going to be a failure, probably might have other disastrous outcomes, and so sadly those have remained valid and they have not been discredited by the outcome of the actual occupation and state building in Afghanistan. As I pointed out, Canada, when Canada went to Afghanistan in 2001, along with NATO and the United States, they participated in a war and they took sides with one of the warring sides, with the warlords. And by doing that, they made them legitimate power holders and they brought them into the government. And so by empowering the warlords and not the Taliban and fighting with the Taliban, they did not really create a space for democratic development of the people, of secular forces, of progressive forces, or of women in the country. And so as a result, over the course of the last 13, 14 years, the various economic policies devised by outside forces, US and NATO, has left a weak state in Afghanistan that has no legitimacy in the eyes of the people. It cannot deliver the kind of policies that it basically designs. And this is linked, I'm just going to insert that of the resources that are distributed in Afghanistan, 80% of them were distributed through NGOs. And this is from World Bank and IMF policy direction where they think civil society groups would deliver better. But what it has done, it has left the state without any capacity basically to deliver and to establish itself as an institution that could be trusted by the people. And that's linked to, again, the weak healthcare system and nutrition program that's basically common in Afghanistan. And so to wrap it up, I guess it's important to assess that Canada's goals initially to go to Afghanistan, and I recall some of the quotes by Harper throughout the course of the 2000s, and how they were emphasizing that this was about building a state, a balanced state, defeating the Taliban, and not really cutting and running from Afghanistan. And in fact, that's exactly what they have done. As Walkham has pointed out, NATO and United States, including Canada, got themselves into a war that they had no idea what they were doing. And so after over a decade of fighting, causing death, suffering, and basically leaving a state in the state that it was in, now they're wrapping up and leaving. So as once again Walkham points out, this was probably not just a failure for Canada, but a failure for NATO in what they tried to do. This was a test case for NATO to see how they would work post-Cold War in a situation of state building, and it has been a massive failure for them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and we can discuss probably.